Hi, this is Krishna Iyer with the Iyer Think Tank in Delray Beach. I'm glad you could join us today. This podcast is, again, another book, Hope and Folly, the United States and Unesco, 1945 to 1985, William Preston, Edward Herman, and Herbert Schiller. We read the first 20 pages yesterday, so we're going to start on page 21, A Survey of History to Come. So I'm going to make some remarks. First, the book, the Google Drive link will be in the description section. Please download the Google Drive link and, add it to your book collection. I always say read my books in their entirety. I would order a copy of the book, like a print book, because that's a better way to get a good idea of what's actually in the book. It's an excellent way of learning. You read the book and then you watch the presentation twice, or you do whatever you want to retain the information. That's the best way to read it. And so buy a print book. They're available on eBay, Amazon, and Books. Those are the three major websites I use to purchase books. They're excellent websites. They make these books available for very reasonable cost. Yes, the government does try to, get in the way of these kinds of readings, but that's a separate issue that, I'm sure will be taken care of in the appropriate time and setting. So we're going to start with a joke. I always like to giggle in the morning. I like to giggle when I watch these presentations because they're, some fun with, giggling when you make jokes. I have an ethics quiz that's a few jokes, like 10, 12 questions. So this is about cultural imperialism. This is about American cultural imperialism and, what an embodiment of cultural imperialism is. So here is the joke. We know the man and woman, the romantic man and woman. The woman's birthday is, one day. I'm sorry, the man's birthday is one day. And, the man comes home from work and the woman says that, oh, I got a cake, but honey, I forgot the candles. And so the man says, oh, no, don't worry, honey, don't worry. I've got him in the car. I'm going to run down to the car and get him. He runs down to the car. He comes up. They cut the cake and have a nice time. So the same kind of thing, the man comes home from, wherever, he's a GI somewhere. And he says, honey, I raped and, murdered and dismembered 40 Hispanic ladies. And I put them in body bags and threw them in the Matanza. What do I do? And, the woman, replies, oh, honey, don't worry. They'll just float away and it'll all be all right. Right? That's ultimately what it is. That's American cultural imperialism. So just know that, there's a really, sick imperialist culture. So just be aware of that. That's a funny little joke to, summarize American cultural imperialism and American culture in general. So let's, continue on. We have the International Court of Justice. We talked yesterday about the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, Trump being a, arrest warrant. He's a convict in the ICJ, but, we're not sure he's going to be prosecuted. He's, done all these illegal actions. He, invaded, Iran. He waged war against Iran, a member of a UNESCO state. He waged war against Venezuela, another member of a UNESCO state. He waged war against Cuba and a naval blockade that is illegal against another UNESCO state. And he is a member of a UNESCO state. So these three things indicate that this man needs to be tried in the International Court of Justice. He is a criminal. He is a, genocidal butcher, a Yankee genocidal butcher, rapist. And he is, needing to have ICJ arrest warrant. Now, the question is whether the ICJ will actually enact this thing. That's another story. It's in Portugal. It's in Dutch. It's a, Portuguese Dutch / center in the Netherlands in The Hague. So basically, because of that, there's no guarantee that, the colonial regime, the colonial court of the International Court of Justice will bring Mr. Trump to justice. That's the problem with with Yankee, criminals. The European colonial courts, allow for, Yankee criminal butcher rapists like Donald Trump to go around and enact their, criminal actions. So that's, a major problem. But in essence, he needs to be tried at the ICJ if there is any justice in, this world. And, the United Nations is aware that America has rejoined UNESCO in 2023, and they waged war on member states after having hated this organization and conducted libel against them for 4 years before they withdrew in 1984. And then all of a sudden they rejoin as a second aspect. So we're going to go through that a little bit anyway, but that's the point. Remember, Trump belongs in the ICJ. The ICJ should arrest him. And then if they arrest him, Mr. Trump, be aware that you'll never be able to see your casinos or travel in Europe. Many of these are signatory states, and you'll be stuck because, you can't schmooze with your, white racist friends in Europe and, your Yankee racist friends. So, be aware it's, kind of a problem. It's a problem for you. It's inconvenient to say the least. Okay, so we're going to also talk about the racist, Yankee press. It's, liar, con artists, illiterates, fabricators, distortions, deliberate, falsifiers and omitters of information. That's the racist press, the Yankee racist, press of con artists. You have all the, news outlets like New York Times, CNN, Washington Post, Newsweek, Reader's Digest, Time Magazine. The Yankee government. This is about UNESCO, okay? UNESCO, this is our discussion of UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO. It's meant to, uplift the third world, increase literacy rates, decrease poverty, increase medical infrastructure, increase economic progress, increase, standardization of, information, standardization of journalism, not have a, fabricated fascist journalism, not be subverted by racist Yankee, butcher, rapist, con artist, liar, fraud, illiterate Yankees. The organization is meant for good, progress in the third world. And, the United States doesn't acknowledge it as or didn't acknowledge it as an organization. Okay, but my statement is the Yankee government needs to be expelled from UNESCO for secretive anti-third world colonial wars after becoming a member of the organization in 2023, after having committed libel and hate speech against the organization by the U.S. mass media and the academia and government until 1984. From 1980 to 1984, and then no funding of the organization, even during their last years of membership. They were out of this United Nations Education, Scientific, and Cultural Organization for 37 years and didn't pay a dime of dues for the third world progressive literacy, food equality, medical infrastructure, improved scientific research, educating the third world public, and promoting third world cultural heritage and autonomy and sovereignty. Then 37 years later, as an afterthought, and feeling alone as a Yankee butcher, rapist, fraud, con artist, they have the nerve to rejoin and hide their previous disinformation campaign and state censorship campaign against UNESCO. They rejoined the organization in 2023, and the hypocritical Yankee racist fraud liars have the audacity to wage a colonial anti-third world war against member states like Iran, Venezuela, and Cuba in violation of the organization's of constitutional principles of third world upliftment. Who are you kidding, Yankee? How dare you, Yankee? You need to be expelled from the organization for conspiracy against the third world. You display unexcused absence in education of the third world and conspiratorial and anti-third world conduct, not becoming of a world superpower. So let's continue. We're going to do the true-false ethics quiz. This is another, giggle section for me. I like to giggle when I watch this video. All right, this is, for the Yankee government, they think ethics and morals are stupid. And so, if you miss these questions, Yankee, you're a criminal Yankee butcher rapist. So, you got to pay attention. The racist Yankee government should be expelled from UNESCO for improper conduct of the fraud liar Yankees and unexcused absence in third world education by the con artist Yankees. That's true. That's true. They need to be expelled from UNESCO for their, absence and their, colonial wars of aggression after rejoining. The fraud racist Yankee relationship with UNESCO is that of a student Yankee with a UNESCO teacher, in which the student fraud con artist Yankee says the teacher is stupid and they want to drop out of the course, right? So that's the fraud racist Yankee relationship between the student Yankee and UNESCO teacher, who's the student, and the Yankee student says, "You're stupid, teacher, and I'm getting out of your course," and that's what the Yankee government did. So let's continue. True, false. The Yankee racist fraud con artist withdrawal from UNESCO in 1984 was to further the Monroe doctrine of Yankee butcher rapist colonial imperialism. That's true. That's true. They had multiple wars of, Monroe doctrine, including, their Middle East, their South America, Panama butcher rapist invasion by the Yankees. And that's what it was. True false, the Yankee con artist, racist media specializes in lies, fabrications, distortions, omissions, and selective reporting. So yes, that's true. That's true. The racist Yankee con artist media specializes in lies, fabrications, distortions, omissions, and selective reporting. The racist Yankee con artist liars attacked UNESCO because they wanted to lie and commit con artist fraud so they wouldn't allow licensing of journalists. Right? And that's the correct thing. That's correct. The racist Yankee con artist liars attacked UNESCO because they wanted to lie and commit con artist fraud so they wouldn't allow licensing of journalists. That's true. The whining Yankee fraud con artist racists didn't like minority vote in UNESCO and so wouldn't accept third world populism, popular opinion over their nativist racist fraud Yankee opinion. Right? I mean, that's the correct thing. The whining Yankee fraud con artist racists didn't like minority vote in UNESCO and so couldn't accept third world populism or popular opinion over their nativist racist fraud Yankee opinion. So that's another one. So next, populists from the third world had unintimidated self-respect, economic cooperation, racial and class unity, and information power that the Yankee fraud con artists wanted to suppress. Right? I mean, that's the correct thing. Populists from the third world had unintimidated self-respect, economic cooperation, racial and class unity, and information power that the Yankee fraud con artists wanted to suppress. Continuing. The Yankee nativism was racist Yankee views of alien cultures as foreign and required imposition of Yankee culture by force, deportation, congressional legislation, and political witch hunt Yankee trials. Right? So that's the correct thing. The Yankee nativism was racist Yankee views of alien cultures as foreign and required imposition of Yankee culture by force, deportation, congressional legislation, and political witch hunt Yankee trials. Joe Block was a Columbia Yankee fraud liar con artist who worked for UNESCO and resigned, and as a hatchet job said that the director, Monroe, was anti-Semitic and anti-white American because he talked about racism in the U.S. media and thought that the Western media was immoral, sensationalistic, decadent, and without ethics. That is true. That was Joe Block's statement from the Columbia Yankee fraud liar con artist, illiterate white, that worked for UNESCO and resigned as a hatchet job, and stated that Monroe was anti-Semitic and he could criticize the media as racist, and called him immoral and sensationalistic, decadent, and without ethics. So that's true. The Western media is racist, immoral, sensationalistic, decadent, and without ethics. So that's correct. That's true. The Western media is racist, immoral, sensationalistic, decadent, and without ethics. So next one, the Bipartisan Heritage Foundation Yankee fraud con artist liar whites said that UNESCO was a socialist organization that was interested in ethics and morality education and disarmament education. Right? I mean, that seems like a reasonable organization, but that is what they said, and that's true. They did say that, and that may have been true, but that's why they got kicked out or they left. They ended up leaving. And finally, the racist Yankee con artist liar frauds like to pretend they were paying huge amounts to UNESCO when they were stealing from the organization and not paying their dues. So that's also true. The racist Yankee con artist liar frauds like to pretend they were paying huge amounts to UNESCO when they were stealing from the organization and not paying their dues. So that's it. That's the quiz. Let's get started. We have 26 pages. We're going to get to the end of this section. It'll be page 46. I'm going to go as fast as I can, but I plan on completing it. A survey of the history to come. These patterns of behavior and outlook suggest an overall national character that determines U.S. multilateral responses. They also represent a mosaic of internal domestic interests, all of which play a role in that international relationship. This survey anticipates this history to come and enhances an understanding of it. Some dozen major groupings or alignments can be discerned in the broad constituency, which will influence UNESCO policy making. Anti-communist members of the national security establishment sees the relationship in East-West terms and view the UN system as an instrument of containment against the Soviets' challenge throughout the world. Since UNESCO came into being at the onset of the Cold War, it was seen as a potential psychological warrior and propaganda spokesman for Western values in the larger anti-communist struggle. The grassroots constituency was more diverse, composed of political spectrum ranging from pro to anti-UN. Heirs of Roosevelt's New Deal and members of the many organizations supporting international collaboration were enthusiastic fans of UNESCO, but some of them were shaken loose from their commitments by the politics of un-Americanism. The snakes in the grassroots, from UNESCO's point of view, were old American firsters, American legionnaires, daughters of American Revolution, China lobbyists, nativists, congressional investigators of deviance and loyalty, patriots who distrusted globaloney, and an assortment of neo-isolationists. The FBI would give them intelligence agency support. They came to see UNESCO as an internal security witness being asked, "Are you now or have you ever been anti-American?" ? In between extremes, the large, amorphous, almost inert majority slowly fermented, mostly uninformed and inattentive, and rarely interested in international news, since it could not itself shape policies. The role was reactive, created by the impact of the powerful lobbies that interested themselves in world affairs. Among the most influential and determined of those participants was the media conglomerates, willing and able to both monitor UNESCO and to shape American thinking about it. From the advertisers to the press and broadcasting industries, to the wire services, to the film and publishing sectors, and finally to the technological inventors of the electronic communications future. As exporters of U.S. culture, they were intimately involved in UNESCO's mandate in the same arena. Their hope envisioned the organization as a U.S. communications consortium. If it were not to be, they would be the first to know and to publicize their displeasure. Other exporting industries were expected to support UNESCO's contributions to international standards, facilitating trade, to international scientific achievement, and to the creation of a more stable, educated, and prosperous consumer society. Cognizant of the economic realities and geopolitical nuances of the global marketplace, they were ready to support the multilateral negotiation of technical assistance and foreign aid directed to development. UNESCO also attracted the attention of single lobbies as its broad mandate intersected with their agendas. Monument restoration and preservation, for example, might entice the tourism following international training and support of the arts, could reach out to that specific community and its patrons. On a more negative note, peace and disarmament projects could upset the Pentagon, banks, and the arms industry. So too, the program of education or archaeological reconstruction, if focused on refugees or sited in disputed territories, might alienate supporters of one or another nation. On the other hand, UNESCO attracted a significant following of intellectuals, professional academics, artists, and freelance adherents of good works scattered in the educational, scientific, and cultural non-governmental organizations linked to UNESCO's goals. It was a large, diverse constituency accustomed to international cooperation and eager to pursue it. Whether it could be united on behalf of this new alliance was unclear. It lacked practice and pressure group influence, had notable inexperience in publicity, and thus a traditional fragmented disciplinary outlook, often consumed by its passion for narrow overspecification in exotic fields. Functionalists and technocrats might not see the big picture or want to. Others might simply settle into the grant-supported world of UNESCO as if they have joined yet another university seminar. All these publics were to be eventually booby-trapped for UNESCO's presence on the national foreign policy scene, and none was more dangerous to UNESCO than the formulator and administrators of that policy, the executive branch of the U.S. government and the State Department. Largely freed from accountability because of the abstruse and secret nature and the distance from the focus of public interest, foreign policy in general has always been the prerogative of the president and his advisors. This is true not only of big power diplomacy and bilateral relations, it is even more obvious in the conduct of international material affairs, especially with the numerous lesser members of the United Nations system. A president can, of course, orchestrate significant attention to any international body by the stature of the people he appoints as delegates and by the notoriety and emphasis he directs to the execution of its business. The UN itself was often to be the beneficiary of such respect. It was not clear whether UNESCO would attract or sustain a similar concern and status. However, even if we're out of the orbit of presidential attraction, UNESCO could still retain a significant hold within the State Department. But crucial developments would have to occur first. The department would have to make multilateral diplomacy a priority, invent and foster a bureau devoted to cultural relations, and deem this pursuit important, stimulate Foreign Service career officers to serve by appropriate patterns of reward and promotion, nominate outsiders of prestige and influence to the UNESCO ambassadorship and mission, and to see it that other policies did not undermine the programs designed to enhance and fulfill UNESCO's goals. The executive response would surely create much of the setting in which the hopes for UNESCO's future would or would not be fulfilled. Not education and not science, not culture is likely to make the front page of the paper, nor do they provide an attractive and immediate reward for practitioners of diplomacy. The Foreign Service establishment was thus both immune from public pressure with a creative free hand at the UNESCO desk and at the same time ambiguous and uncertain about engaging in that creativity. And that tension between opportunity and neglect was a counterpart to the larger polarity between commitment of national interest on the one hand and to international service and cooperation on the other. While the United States brought to the UNESCO idea a certain traditional ideology and character formed during a century and a half of national experience, it was also influenced in its response by its own immediate historical background. Although UNESCO itself was still not even a dream in some philosopher's mind, premonitions of it were beginning to stir in the aftermath of the first great global conflagration. The 1920s and 30s spawned some of the theories that came together in 1945, and those same years further underlined the issues that were to make UNESCO such an attractive option for the peacemakers. Both the shock of the bloodbath and trenches and the consequent evil fury of Nazi doctrine and propaganda seemed to bring the same desperate and urgent message. Someone had to dam the flow of hatred and intolerance, lest the world submerge forever in the violent manifestations of that bitterness. So we're going to just make some comments. That's actually the whole section, which goes patterns and problems. In the American past, we talked about nativism, right? We talked about the nativism that was the doctrine of, foreign and alienness, basically the Yankee fraud liar, butcher, rapist, con artist, had nativism as the way they would react. And we talked about, by force, deportation, immigration, and naturalization legislation, and political witch hunt Yankee trials. So that was that. We talked about that. That was the free enterprise in the media. Basically the free enterprise was the hypocrisy that has concealed the contradictory purposes the United States has pursued, and especially from itself, since the elaboration of its manifest destiny to expand its claim of invincibility and omnipotence as number one has been framed as a world responsibility devoid of superpower lust and ambition thrust upon it and reluctantly and unselfishly accepted. So that's the Yankees, unselfish and unlustful, unambitious, Yankee whites. That's correct. That's, fraud, con artist, liar Yankee, liar Yankee, illiterate Yankee, hypocrites. That's what that means. That's illiterate Yankee, hypocrite, Yankees. All right, so that's that. So we talked about that, Pax Americanus. He goes through all of the things that, caused the, explanation that they were colonialists, were lusting for power and ambition and thrust upon it, selfishly accepted, self-servingly accepted. And then a survey of history to come. We talk basically about the national character of UNESCO, the United Nations Educational Scientific Organization, and, the U.S., just falling short on all means. They started to get wrapped up in, anti-Soviet containment of this organization was in, a scientific education and cultural organization. So they tried to turn it into an anti-communist and, anti-nationalist, anti-third world organization, an organization meant for third world upliftment. They did, try a switcheroo in which, the Yankee fraud conartists-lies made it an anti-third world organization. So that's problematic, and that's why they ended up leaving, and dropping out of the course. So let's continue. The Nazi challenge and 2 world wars, the hostile imagination unleashed. If war is 13,000 years old, as some experts believe, it has probably engaged the attention of reformers for almost as long. However, the 20th century configuration has aided new dimensions and analysis to that reform impulse because the same economic and technological advances that have made war more total and more devastating have already made its control more possible. Yet even humanity faces another double bind. The means of communication and mutual understanding may course as well as prevent the outbreak of conflict. As William Randolph Hearst told one of the photographers on his way to Cuba in 1898, "You furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war." Indeed, education could be the source of chauvinism and unreasoning antagonism toward all neighboring states. As far back as 30-year wars, the idea of intellectual cooperation in the cause of peace had surfaced. In the 1970s, and more frequently still in the 20th, institutes and scientific associations had taken on international shapes in the hope of solving common problems, sharing knowledge, and instilling the habit of cooperation, at least among the educated elite. When mass public education became an adjunct of the modern state, and when popular journalism with its vast circulation rose to prominence in the industrialized West, could modern mass propaganda be far behind? World War I answered those questions, and the participants quickly exploited the enormous propaganda potential of mass communications and the mass marketing of grotesque poster image to turn public opinion against the enemy, dehumanizing and demonizing each other with tales of unimaginable brutality and violence. The combatants clearly understood, as George Creel's American Committee on Public Information asserted, that they were in a fight for the mind of mankind. But the excesses of that information debauchery led some of the survivors to compliment the communication horror they had created in succeeding years. The advent of radio raised the stakes even higher, since access to men's minds could now be instantaneous, worldwide, across national leaders, and apparently unstoppable. It was beginning to sink in to a few men's minds that propaganda is an armament, and if the world were to survive, it better be disarmed in the war of words. Stunned by the ferocious impact of mass communications, yet trapped by the usual cultural lag in the face of rapidly changing technology, the reformers took a few uncertain steps forward to control the propaganda menace in the interwar years, proposals that would anticipate the post-war debates in UNESCO. One route led down the traditional elite road of intellectual cooperation, a trickle-down version for dispensing mutual understanding. Another recognized the mass base of international friction and attacked the abuses of radio. A third position, acknowledging the narrow political orientation of the League of Nations, stressed that the collective security mandate protecting territorial integrity was not enough. Numerous nations therefore fashioned new programs of cultural relations as part of their national normal foreign policy outlook, and a fourth point of view featuring the role of the press evaluated the reasons for its failure to promote better international harmony. Taken together, these activities testified to increasing global concern over the underlying economic, social, cultural, and ideological origins of the conflict among nations. The technological revolution had now moved them all into potentially malevolent proximity, living a broadcast away from the mob mentality. If human beings were to clean up their act, what innovations and ideas would spur them on? A League committee formed in 1921 invented the International Institute of Intellectual Cooperation 5 years later, largely a French-influenced approach. In 1925, the International Bureau of Education was founded to promote cooperation at the elementary and secondary levels, neglected by the IIIC. The International Council of Scientific Unions stood as the preeminent representative of the unofficial collaboration of the world's scientists. France, Germany, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom, meanwhile, led in governmental attention to transnational cultural affairs. While these supposed positive long-range fallout of beneficial results, the fast track of immediate reform dealt with the press and radio, where, quote, menacing, inflammatory, subversive, and warmongering incitements could be easily undercut, whatever positive effects more abstract, detached formulae were having on the international mind. Broadcasting and interwar propaganda. While it has become customary to ascribe ulterior motives to Soviet peace and disarmament schemes, in fact, they surfaced as a contemporary and Western response to radio broadcasting more insidious propensities. As early as 1922, corporate spokesman Owen D. Young, president of General Electric, warned the nations of Europe to beware that medium's dangerous side propaganda, urging them to refrain from hurling insults at each other in furious language. Soon thereafter, in 1927, some international legal authorities suggested that states had the responsibility to control propaganda, fake news, or defamation directed at foreign countries by citizens of their own nation. 27 states passed such legislation. In the 1928 Kellogg-Briand Pact outlawing war implied that incitements to war were equally criminal and should be brought within the rule of law, a notion later pursued at Nuremberg. A number of nations signed bilateral treaties doing just that, and in 1936 at the Geneva Convention on Broadcasting in the Cause of Peace, 22 nations agreed to ensure that the transmissions do not constitute an incitement to war or to acts likely to lead to war. Neither the three Axis powers nor the United States signed, the latter insisting on the private nature of the media, from which only voluntary and patriotic cooperation could be requested. In 1933 and again in 1940, Latin Americans nurtured agreements to use radio to foster goodwill among them and to avoid disruptive and defamatory broadcasts. As the fascist dictatorship got a feel for total radio concept, the quantity of libelous and subversive propaganda in the air increased dramatically. Designed to destroy morale and unity abroad and prepare the minds of their own people for war, these preparatory communication forays behind soon-to-be enemy lines helped create the concept of group libel. As a defense, this is, of course, a people's or group's rights policy, since it protects from malicious defamation any group, class, or race, and even under some legislation, any profession or religion. Defined as unprotected speech in the United States in the 1952 Supreme Court decision, Beauharnais versus Illinois, group libel became a recognized rule of international law, even though it had little effect on the circulation thereafter of false and slanderous charges among the world's sovereign states. Although ideologic warfare, which could be called the fifth column of the air, dominated the nefarious abuse of radio in the 1930s, other broadcasters tried to shape minds in a less aggressive way. The imperial powers used shortwave transmission of information to help maintain control over their colonies scattered around the globe. And the League created radio nations in an unsuccessful effort to promote mutual understanding and goodwill. Failure to stem the tide of false news and disinformation in those decades led still others to champion the international right to reply as a legally enforceable self-defense, a sort of equal time to build the ramparts of peace occasionally. The International Judicial Congress favored it in 1929, and the International Federation of Journalists followed suit in 1934. The United States, where the idea was an anomaly, remained opposed, although the right did not contradict the free flow, free market traditions of that nation. Fascination with the power and responsibility of radio as the favored medium of international communications did not impede examination of the press. Successive league-sponsored conferences between 1926 and 1932, experts explored such issues as property rights in news, identity cards, peacetime censorship, and expulsion of journalists. Supporting free press principles in general, these same meetings echoed the concerns expressed about the broadcast media and called upon the publishing industry to avoid news causing international misunderstanding and suspicious detriment to peace. Participants even promoted a professional code of honor with an enhancement instrument and to prevent false information from attaining wider circulation. Enlarging ideas of press responsibility dating back to 1893, the League of Nations also passed resolutions in 1927 opposing all news that was obviously inaccurate, highly exaggerated, or deliberately distorted, and called on the press not to cause suspicions detrimental to international peace. In 1931, the International Federation of Journalists set up a tribunal of professional honor with the power to declare unworthy anyone publishing mendacious information capable of arousing the public against a foreign nation. And Czechoslovakia and Switzerland took steps to block the importation and circulation of foreign propaganda literature. The New World Information Order was already struggling to be born. Although the United States succumbed to the lure of poisonous propaganda during World War I, its official policy during the interwar years upheld the free flow, free market doctrines on behalf of a free enterprise press. It remained, therefore, opposed to or aloof from various reform proposals that attempted to create legal sanctions controlling the explosion of contaminated information, though it supported the international cultural cooperation then just beginning to take important shape. However, several significant challenges to this high-minded liberal neutrality led the U.S. into policy initiatives contradictory to the pure private sector free flow philosophy by which it defined its international stand. These challenges include the European cartel of news agencies, the radio and right of reply regulations adopted abroad, the Axis propaganda offensive in Latin America, and its own development of cultural relations as an instrument of national policy. On its face, U.S. opposition to the worldwide divisions of wire services rights among the British, French, and German press associations seemed to strike a blow for the free market philosophy of competition. Ever since its formation in 1870, the Associated Press had rankled at this monopolistic agreement, and after its 1907 founding, the United Press objected as well. Still, it was consistent with the trust movement then underway in the United States, of which John D. Rockefeller was an imaginative and leading proponent. However, criticism leveled by U.S. agencies against the European cartel not only anticipated later denunciations by the Third World, but also raised questions about bias in the free market of news, those innate distortions produced by culture and national origin themselves. To the U.S., the cartel's coverage was slanted both in the selection of stories and the rewriting of them. The European wire services negatively misrepresented the U.S. scene and favored news serving the diplomatic and imperial interests of their own nations. At the Geneva meetings, the United States felt, however, that false news had nothing to do with the culture or even monopoly power. It had its origins in government control, and the solution was a free press. It would never admit that news was a commodity, even while arguing that for property rights in that news. The broadcast regulations being proposed and adopted in Europe against the warmongering and subversive and defamatory propaganda should have won the support of the U.S. free market advocates. for they went no further in theory than the Federal Communications Commissions did. Radio, excuse me, radio was, after all, licensed by the U.S. government, operated in the public interest and convenience, and had to observe the fairness doctrine, given the immense harm radio propaganda could inflict. This broader responsibility of regulatory collaboration cannot be disclaimed, one critic asserted, by merely invoking the phrase free speech. An international obligation required something more. As already noted, support for an international right of reply did not even involve a violation of the free market ideology, although it might have seen in the United States an invasion of the press owner's property rights. However, when Axis propaganda took on an international character and began promoting an intellectual imperial intervention into Latin America, this cultural subversion aroused Monroe Doctrine reflexes to the North. The free enterprise flow of information did not seem to promise that the truth would, in fact, defeat lies in the free marketplace of ideas. What the Axis total radio blitzkrieg had done was to suggest how equality of power, resources, and content can undermine every meaning of the marketplace theory. Radio Berlin was a media giant, able to establish a preferred position, drive out less powerful voices, and control the agenda of the debate. The United States had to respond, but it was not sure exactly how to do so. It remained fixated on pure and simple free-flow doctrine. The government might do nothing at all, but then the fascists might win an influential ideological share of the Latin American mind and market. The U.S. solution embraced a government initiative with a covertly funded private sector component, aimed partially at the elite leadership, but directed also at the public at large, and not sure in its self-definition whether it was a national security project or another open-door adventure in missionary diplomacy. The U.S. would have preferred the world to convert to its way of life, attracted by the very exceptionalism of their values. In that sense, it must have imagined cultural relations as a kind of genetic engineering experiment to turn the international mind into the American mind. But soft cell liberalism always had a harder side of national interest that foreigners distrusted. As Margaret Blanchard had argued, the United States knew how to combine noble intentions, quote unquote, with quote unquote nobility of purpose, with self-interest, quote unquote, and commercial advantage, quote unquote. Fighting Axis propaganda. To turn aside the Axis threat and position itself in the arena where the minds are actively shaped. The U.S. government created the State Department's Division of Cultural Relations in 1938 and the Office of the Coordinator of Inter-American Affairs in 1940. The United States thus became the last of the big powers to adopt culture as a big part of diplomatic outreach, and it did so for reasons that deformed its cultural relations program for years to come. Beginning as a negative reaction to an alien ideology, it remained rooted in a defensive stance of bipolar anti-Nazi and later anti-communist extremism without paying sufficient regard to the feelings of the people to whom it was directed. The U.S. lacked the sense of reciprocity, that ear for local culture and its message for the U.S. It tended to be yet another conversion experience. These attitudes were to plague the U.S. and UNESCO relationship as well. In addition to their reactive origins, cultural relations also suffered from the immediacy of the crisis that brought them into being. The U.S. was fighting off the inroads overseas of Nazi propaganda, which demanded instant results and thus led to an emphasis on short-run returns over long-term benefits in cultural contexts. Initially, the Division of Cultural Relations focused on Latin American elites, with student exchanges to the U.S. designed to instill pro-U.S. attitudes among the candidates for leadership positions at home. The United States' own intellectual modernization had been created by a superstructure of institutions with which the government could collaborate to keep its own intervention at a distance. The American Council of Learned Societies, the American Liberty Association, the Institute of International Education, and the American Council of Education would serve this purpose. Quickly abandoning the notions of cultural reciprocity, the Office of Inter-American Affairs went into action by covertly funding private organizations to promote State Department cultural policies. Those in turn became increasingly oriented to national security ends. Exclusion of ideologically suspect foreign exchange candidate led to wartime visa denials for Pablo Neruda, owing to Communist Party membership, and Jacques Maritain for his Gaullist connections. The two programs expanded rapidly. In Latin America by the war's end, 27 cultural centers were operating and 200 American schools were receiving OLAA financial support through the American Council on Education. In 1941, the Division of Cultural Relations had moved into China, hoping to induce intellectual liberalization. By then a second level of covert involvement had developed. The OSS secretly bankrolled a graduate school of journalism at Chongqing in 1943. A Near East section began operations in the same year, so that in 1945, the year UNESCO was given constitutional form, the United States had 48 cultural relations officers and 70 libraries in some 30 countries. The purpose of all this was still to penetrate the minds and control the behavior of others along U.S. lines by completing the global liberal revolution begun by Great Britain. Americans apparently believed that culture could wield irresistible political influence and that they could Americanize the world without manipulating it. As the United States was improvising its cultural relations policies, that program itself was overtaken by the impact of World War II, a mobilization of ideology that added new techniques and strategies to the assault on men's minds. Both the Office of War Information and the Office of Strategic Services had a role in the modernization of propaganda, which influenced the nation's opportunity for effective cultural relations and multilateral cultural cooperation in UNESCO. Formed in 1942, the OWI, unlike leaders like Archibald MacLeish and Elmer Davis, hoped it could deliver the facts and contribute to the informed and intelligent understanding necessary to sustain wartime morale and to formulate agreement on and support for the Allies' post-war goals. MacLeish and Davis were perhaps premature UNESCO utopians, already imagining ways to build the defenses of peace. Their point of view was rapidly victimized by the military bureaucracy, chary of sharing information and of truth-talking, and by the political leadership that distrusted the liberal definitions of the post-war world. They wanted to suppress the facts about Vichy, China, colonialism, and other embarrassing political realities. Although it had not wanted to manipulate opinion, the OWI became an adjunct of military-sponsored psychological warfare and win the war boosterism. By 1945, OWI propaganda could claim that nowhere in the world must the U.S. renounce its moral and ideologic interests as a powerful and righteous nation. Information as deception and covert dirty tricks symbolized wartime operations of the OSS under Colonel William Donovan. Totally false or black propaganda designed to disrupt enemy plans and destroy enemy morale became ingrained as a legitimate arm of the national security interest without regard to its impact on the practitioners or the U.S. citizenry and constitutional system. Subverting and transforming became an intelligence agency obsession, one that would become a covert companion to the more overt forces of international persuasion. The United States could come to UNESCO with intelligence operations controlled by an elite to shape the minds of men in other ways. Even the ideal of international education, to which UNESCO would devote so much of its resources, may have had a hidden U.S. agenda attached to it. In 1943, the Congress set up a liaison committee on the subject to promote a plan for a UN permanent educational agency to assume for the United States its habitual and unpopular role of missionary to the world. By the end of World War II, the nations of the world and their peoples had obviously embraced and fortified the hostile imagination to an extent never before believed possible. The technology of hate and deception and the evil undercurrents of slander and defamation had contaminated cultural relations for some decades. Yet numerous countries and their intellectual and professional elites also created institutions and educational opportunities and created institutional opportunities for human solidarity and transnational cooperation. Mind-changing had been and would remain one of the foremost priorities of the day, and possibly the only way out of slums of violence in which the hostile imagination must always dwell. But what form of the world that mind-changing take under whose control and for what ends? From the U.S. experience, a large number of options seem possible. The United States could adopt the multilateral UNESCO approach to shape the minds of men, or it could improve and ensure the full reciprocity of its own cultural relations activities. It might also turn its cultural relations into a unilateral weapon of an aggressive foreign policy, a kind of cultural pacification program. A combination of overt and covert cultural diplomacy might also be utilized to spread American values and reconstitute the international mind. The United States might even make UNESCO an instrument of its own cultural priorities if it had the political influence to do so. Their choices seem clearly delineated. Would culture or information as propaganda dominate? Would minds be shaped by the fast media or the slow? Would cultural relations be truly reciprocal or one way? Would the national interest and the American way triumph, or would the universalities and cultural relativism prevail? It had, unfortunately, been the common experience everywhere for the truth to yield to the propaganda of self-interest and national security. But as the exhausted victors looked out over the smoking ruins of battle in 1945, building the defenses of peace in the minds of men must not have seemed such a bad idea. So that's that section. That section is the Nazi challenge and the two world wars. So we discussed basically dehumanizing and demonizing each other with tales of unimaginable brutality and violence. The combatants clearly understood, as George Creel's American Committee on Public Information asserted, that they were in a fight for the mind of mankind. But the excesses of information debauchery, that's fraud, Yankee fraud, media, led some of the observers to contemplate the communication horror that they created in the succeeding years. The advent of radio raised the stakes even higher, since access to men's minds could now be instantaneous worldwide across national borders and apparently unstoppable. So basically that's it, convey to, men's minds, the Yankee fraud, con artists lie, illiterate propaganda. That's what the Yankees do. They, convey through their media, debauchery, cheating, lying, con artist, fraud, Yankee, liar, racist, liar, Yankees. So that's that one. That's the first thing. Then we talked about, basically broadcasting interwar propaganda. We talked a little bit about the fascist dictatorship and all that stuff. And then we talked a little bit about, although the United States succumbed to the lure of poisonous propaganda during World War I, its official policy during the interwar years upheld the free flow, free market doctrines on behalf of a free enterprise press. It remained, therefore, opposed to or aloof from various reform proposals that attempted to create legal sanctions controlling the explosion of contaminated information, though it supported the international cultural cooperation then just beginning to take important shape. So basically, contaminated information was okay by the U.S. The Yankee fraud, con artists, illiterate liar Yankees. That was all that was okay. It was all fine. Everything goes. You can, lie, open fabrications, falsifications, omission. It's all okay for the Yankee fraud, con artists. Okay, so that's that. That's the first thing we talked about. Then, we also talked about, policy initiatives contradictory to the private free flow philosophy. Basically, the European cartel of news agencies the radio and right of reply regulations adopted abroad, and the Axis propaganda offensive in Latin America and its own development of cultural relations as an instrument of U.S. policy. So that was that. And then we talked, again about, the United States had to respond, but it was not sure exactly how to do so. If it remained fixated on pure and simple free flow doctrine, the government might do nothing at all, but then the fascists might win an influential ideologic share of the Latin American mind and market. So they basically embraced a government initiative with a covertly funded private sector component aimed partially at the elite leadership but directed also to the public at large, and not sure in its self-definition whether it was a national security project or another open-door adventure in missionary diplomacy. The U.S. would have preferred the world to convert to its way of life, attracted by the very exceptionalism of their values. It must have imagined cultural relations as a kind of genetic engineering experiment to turn the international mind into the American mind. So you see the Yankee con artist culture is basically, genetically engineer, the foreign, the third world mind into the American mind. That's how you call, cultural, cultural, equality, right? Cultural equality. We, support your culture, but we genetically turn your mind into, the American mind, the racist Yankee, fraud, butcher, rapist, Yankee, con artist, liar, liar, illiterate Yankees. So that's that. That's the, basically it. That's the, the genetic engineering of the Yankee mind, from the third world mind. Just genetically engineer the fraud Yankee con artist liars into the third world mind. So continuing on, fighting Axis propaganda, we talked about, basically the U.S. lacked the sense of reciprocity, that ear for local culture and its message for the U.S. It tended to be yet another conversion experience. These attitudes were to plague the U.S.-UNESCO relationship as well. In addition to the reactive origins, cultural relations also suffered from the immediacy of the crisis that brought them into being. The U.S. was fighting off the inroads overseas of Nazi propaganda, which demanded instant results and then led to an emphasis on short-run returns over the long-run benefits in cultural content. So, of course, the U.S., the Yankee fraud con artists, they just basically, just local culture, just dismiss the local culture. They basically, conversion of the local culture, anti-communist extremism, beginning as a negative reaction to alien ideology, it remained rooted in a defensive stance of bipolar anti-Nazi and later anti-communist extremism without paying sufficient regard to the feelings of the people to whom it was directed. So the U.S. Yankees, it doesn't matter who you talk to, right? You're racist, butcher, rapist Yankees. All you do is just propaganda. Doesn't matter who you talk to. You're just the local culture. You're just cultural genocide. It's, our way or the highway. That's, basically all it is. So we talked about, the UNESCO, the United States was improvising. Okay, so we talked about... So the point of view, okay, so we said that, it was necessary, informed and intelligent understanding, necessary to sustain wartime morale and formulate agreement on and support of the Allies' post-war goals. McLeish and Davis were perhaps premature UNESCO utopians already imagining to build the defenses of peace, but their point of view was rapidly victimized by the military Yankee bureaucracy, chary of sharing information and of truth-taking, and by the political leadership that trusted the liberal definitions of the post-war world. They wanted to suppress the facts about Vichy, China colonialism, and other embarrassing aspects of political realities. So that's the Yankee approach. Just suppress suppress the colonialism, to suppress, all of your, criminal, Yankee butcher rapist actions in China, in, colonies, and all of your colonies. And, the Vichy regime and what you did in Vichy, France, and, it's all fine. It's just Yankees are, the only one, even though they're illiterate, fraud Yankee, liar, con artist Yankees. So that's that, and that's one thing. And then we finished up with the U.S. experienced a large number of options seemed possible. The United States could adopt a multilateral UNESCO approach to shape the minds of men, or it could improve and ensure the full reciprocity of its own cultural relations activities. Basically a combination of overt and cultural diplomacy might also be utilized to spread American values and reconstitute the international mind. So everything indicates that the United States basically used UNESCO as an instrument of its own cultural priorities if it had political influence to do so. So basically, the Yankees, any organization is fair game, for their political, for their cultural imperialism. They do whatever they want. They're racist Yankee fraud, con artists, liar, illiterate Yankees. So that's it. UNESCO's origins, liberal hopes and liberal assumptions. Historians analyzing the wartime statements that U.S. political leaders made about the significance of and the necessity for international education and cultural exchange must surely believe they are witnessing an assembly of faith healers selling ideologic nostrums to an audience of true believers. The revival atmosphere that characterized this burst of utopian expectations had its inevitable backlash, but at the times, no one seemed aware of national and international political realities. Quite the opposite, the deluge of slaughter and the menace of its total and final climax under the atom's bright sun only confirmed their authenticity of everyone's incredible paroxysm of hope. Secretary of State Cordell Hull, a Tennessee pragmatist, began the exhortation in 1940 when he insisted that education has a role of the first importance to play in building the foundations of a just and lasting peace. At the 1945 UN Founding Conference in San Francisco, President Harry Truman urged the gathering to set up effective agencies for consistent and thorough interchange of thought and ideas. For there lies in the road to a better and more tolerant understanding among nations and among peoples. His Secretary of State, James Burns, added, I can't conceive of no more important endeavor than to make the mind of man a constructive force for peace. The effort is fundamental. Men work together most effectively when they have learned to think together and feel together. And alluding to the nuclear menace, Burns concluded that basic security lies in the creation of mutual trust and confidence among the peoples of the world. In London, Prime Minister Clement Attlee keynoted UNESCO's November 1945 founding conference by raising the basic question, do not wars, after all, begin in the minds of men? Were the peoples of the world not islands shouting at each other over seas of misunderstanding? And J.B. Priestley's called the meeting the most underrated conference in all history. William Benton, again Secretary of State and Vice Chairman of the American delegation, also claimed that UNESCO, in its potentials, was the most underrated organization in history and could weigh the balance for peace. Pursuing a democracy of mind and spirit where every culture would be free to live and develop, Benton believed UNESCO might become a force of the first magnitude for peace and prosperity by a moral and intellectual revolution. No piece of the UN system was more intimately related with the day-by-day life of people and more necessary. It would be part of a great plan of worldwide teamwork and indispensable. Certain that UNESCO could reflect the depth and fervor of the humans' hope and expectation that created it, Archibald MacLeish, chairman of the U.S. delegation, confirmed that the organization was particular importance to his countrymen, helping them and all their fellow citizens elsewhere to root out the prejudice and ignorance which have separated them in the past. UNESCO would in fact be a new thing in the history of international undertakings. The U.S. public apparently agreed, for 85% of them in an 1945 poll, favored an organization which would marshal the forces for understanding among the peoples of the world. As Benton defined the project, its very immensity did not seem to daunt him or others. They were going to accomplish the intellectual equivalent of geology's continental drift, moving the people of the earth from the nation-bound assertions of my country, right or wrong, to a far-reaching my world, my human race, and in a tiny fraction of geological time. They pictured schools all over the globe that would teach children how to understand the peoples of other countries. And they acknowledged that UNESCO's responsibilities would be as wide and intangible as the human mind and spirit. If this mandate was to be as vast as it was imprecise, and as one critic later complained, with a bannerhead phrase that had all the resounding opacity of such phrases as at their most dense, did anyone then wonder whether the joint convulsion of optimism had any dangerous side effects? The French, in their eternal cynical practicality, did suggesting that the UNESCO project just might be a pork barrel riding on a cloud. Yet in just 16 days of intense consultation in London in November 1945, 44 nations concocted a constitution giving concrete paper reality to their dreams and hopes. Within a year, the United States Congress had passed legislation committing their country to this adventurous undertaking by an overwhelming vote of approval. It would turn out to be the high point of Allied unity and of American political enthusiasm. Other currents of ill will and misunderstanding were already in circulation, and the great UNESCO gamble still faced the hurdles of self-definition and organizational integrity. The new multilateralism. If those explorers of international intellectual and cultural cooperation bravely set sail for a different shore, what kind of multilateral vessel was to carry them there, and did it have a compass? Multilateralism is, of course, a far more complicated operation than the favored two-day diplomatic discourse. What is more, the nations assembled in London were embarking on a cultural and educational voyage, even though these topics remained subordinate to political, military, and economic interests. Moreover, this was a multilateral experiment at a time when even their bilateral training was still underdeveloped, and the UNESCO founders were imagining a mass experiment in the most novel and untested fields of human endeavor. It is interesting to compare what was being said at that very time about the U.S. State Department to get a sense of the odds against it. A modern foreign policy for the United States. In Modern Foreign Policy for the United States, Joseph Jones, a career Foreign Service officer, wrote, "The department is an unbelievably inefficient organization. It is not run, it just jerks along." And Secretary of State Dean Acheson recalled that nobody has been able to run the State Department in 150 years. Even if the statements were exaggerated, they represent a lack of planning or clear lines of authority and function and of coordination. Presidents often had deplored the State Department's built-in inertia, deadened initiative, and tendency toward excessive delay. Some years later, Dean Russ was to say that the heart of the bureaucratic problem in the state is the inclination to avoid responsibility. If UNESCO was to surmount the bureaucratic problems endemic to conduct the foreign affairs and fulfill the goals of its founders, it would also have to be something new under the sun to the quagmire of administration. The miracle of in purpose would have to be accompanied by a miracle in management as well. The planners, of course, were as optimistic in creating the structure of operations as they had been in delineating the goals. They believed they had inoculated UNESCO against the most common infections of international collaboration and armed it against the propensity to self-destruct. In the first place, it was to be independently run by a cadre of international civil servants free from the taint of national self-interest and government control. Loyalty to one's country was to be perfectly compatible with loyalty to internationalism, promoting security and welfare everywhere, being true service to one's country's highest interest. UNESCO staff members would have also those qualities of integrity, conviction, courage, imagination, drive, and technical grasp that would guarantee professional, objective, and successful organizational performance. In his testimony to Congress, Benton said the United States had the obligation not to seek to exert influence upon the U.S. citizens who may be chosen for that staff. Their selection, in fact, would largely be guided by the nation's professional and voluntary organizations, recommending candidates to their governments, and doing so as members of the UNESCO National Commission in each country. The Director General and his staff would not seek or receive instructions from any government or any authority exterior to the organization. Thus insulated and backed by the non-governmental organizations, UNESCO would represent people speaking to people through their own representative institution. Not only would this provide an independent civil service, it would also guarantee an unbiased, objective search for knowledge and its nonpartisan formulation and exchange in the name of mutual understanding. UNESCO's hard currency would be neutral and technical, and apparently universally accepted truths as certain as the data discovered by the natural sciences. The founders seem to have envisioned a world bank of knowledge protected against fraud by some pure fact and ideal law. or fair trade in information legislation. To control the hair trigger of political outrage by nation states, UNESCO would not publish anything offensive to them or engage in any activity that constructed an intervention in matters essentially in their domestic jurisdiction. The U.S. Congress, for example, excluded atomic energy and any information or knowledge in which such disclosure is prohibited by any law of the United States. UNESCO certainly was not to possess the authority to tell any government what to do. It was essentially a service and advising institution, conceiving, planning, and proposing the programs that the International Secretariat believed to be the most essential defenses of peace that can be built in men's minds. Nor would the world's intellectual leadership in UNESCO follow any narrow partisan definition of its expansive mission, for they would speak in all universal language of science, art, and learning. As a partnership of all cultures, UNESCO would preserve and stimulate each of them in totally reciprocal interchange of tradition, values, and ideas, honoring each for its unique contribution to the total planetary civilization in which they must all coexist. Fundamental to the success of the United Nations, UNESCO would command the respect of the learned communities for its fair-minded objectivity of government, for respect of learned fair-minded of governments, for the international neutrality and of peoples for its cultural sensitivity. This may have been UNESCO of which George Shultz was thinking when he urged it to return to its original principles and founding purposes, but that UNESCO had not, of course, ever existed except perhaps in the dreams of its founders. Several contemporary and timely warnings, however, cautioned its original nation-state members to abide by the rules and allow UNESCO to fair play latitude to give up those expectations. William Benton said it would remain only a piece of paper if starved for leadership or funds or bypassed when governments deal with knotty problems. James Torrey Badeau, who was to become UNESCO's second Director General, reminded the founding conference that if its programs educated for peace while life itself taught war, we should not be creating men, we should be creating victims of life. Nor could the search to reduce tensions and misunderstanding avoid debate on the ultimate issues of life and simply exchange meaningless agreement on shallow generalities about the unity of mankind. As Reinhold Neuberg pointed out, countries would have to accept some diminution of their sovereignty to find a national interest in the UNESCO's work itself. But cultural exchange could not become cultural politics, or the ideals of 1945 would be vitiated at the start. More important, since the communication between peoples could be as easily intensified as ease of their mutual suspicions, its quality would necessarily become one of UNESCO's primary concerns. All in all, the founders had written a menu that allowed no substitutions. The question was whether they would now order a la carte. Quote unquote free press and the UNESCO Constitution. Testing of UNESCO's Constitution began with its formulation and has continued to the present. As definition of purpose and organizations of power, constitutions attract politics the way a honey lures flies. Since the UNESCO idea blossomed as part of the victor's peace among allies with its own national agendas and was then given flesh and blood by its first leadership, the liberal hopes and assumptions had to be reconciled with both the realities of certain self-serving intentions and the practical adjustments of life of the organization itself. What did the U.S. think the Constitution meant, and how did other countries and UNESCO itself perceive it, and what did they all want it to become? The United States brought a wish list of national political priorities linked to its traditional foreign policy aim and its current status as the post-war world's dominant power. Excuse me. It still believed in the open door concept of informal empire, a free trade market position that regarded international organizations as important elements in reducing barriers to free flow of all kinds and in stabilizing internal orders wherever those barriers collapsed. Excuse me, sorry. Confident in its ability to disperse its immense resources and know-how effectively and thereby triumph in any competitive contest, the U.S. preached international cooperation while practicing elite control. If the Imperium once followed the flag, it now might find entry through international standards legitimized by collective agreement. UNESCO might reproduce Western-style economic liberalism and political values in the name of the free flow concept of mutual understanding. Today, UNESCO, tomorrow, the world. However, influencing the minds of men and creating that mutual understanding were the Pandora's box of politics in the history of the United States' relationship with UNESCO. It is one of the immense ironies of the post-war era that the war would be followed by the war of words. World War would be followed by the war of words as nations realized the limitless opportunities of mass communications and changing values and perspectives. The information age was dawning, and the UNESCO preamble invited its constituents to build the defenses of peace on a global scale and thereby modify behavior everywhere. The United States naturally believed it had the resources, skills, and point of view to achieve this purpose single-handedly. It was a mission waiting to happen. Realizing that culture now could wield irresistible political influence, a fact underscored by the post-war and wartime propaganda successes, the U.S. delegation to UNESCO insisted that communications receive an equal emphasis with education, science, and culture as one of UNESCO's main priorities. And the U.S. meant, of course, mass communications for those were the fast track of immediate impact on minds as opposed to the traditional instruments of the show print media in the other three areas. Ideas, Benton insisted, are weapons, and the mass media obviously were the information equivalent of missile delivery systems. Unleashing the U.S. media by guaranteeing the international freedom of the press, breaking the foreign wire services cartel's monopoly of world news, and promoting the free enterprise model of news dissemination would thus tie the self-interest of U.S. publishers, broadcast, and wire service owners to UNESCO's search for the architect of peace. U.S. journalistic entrepreneurs purported to be convinced that a free press and the free exchange of news would end international misunderstandings and prevent war. Dismissing their commercial ambitions and profitable investments as irrelevant, the media leaders defined their product as unbiased, impartial, and reliable. In fact, the basis of peace, since their news would not be tainted or falsified by government censorship or control. So intense was this commitment to the free market ideology that they strenuously opposed at first any United States government information activity at all in the post-war international sphere. William Benton and his State Department allies had to fight hard to overcome this hostility, a sort of dress rehearsal for the controversy aroused by the third world critics of free market information policies in succeeding decades. Even some American industry's own practitioners considered the official media position as a sanctimonious, smug attitude and wondered, did God anoint them? ? Although the industry leaders believed in the U.S. media's capacity to free people from dictatorship and propaganda by dispensing the truths that their columns concocted, their government recognized the inadequate dimensions of the free market approach in winning the battle for men's minds, while also emphasizing their truth of governmental communications. The State Department specialists believed their version of the American way represented a higher form of truth. This Orwellian instance that some truths are more equal than others meant that the United States would bring to its participation in UNESCO both the media commitment to free market ideology and circulation of information on the government's own contention that its information had an even higher priority in promoting peace. UNESCO was thus in double jeopardy, a potential partner of the media monopolies and a possible collaborator in the propaganda voice of its foremost and influential collaborator. The campaign to internationalize the First Amendment had its immediate origins in 1944 congressional resolution and the election of year platforms of both political parties, which committed U.S. policy to international freedom of the press. The free press theme reappeared in the 1945 Potsdam Conference and in a U.S. proposal to include it in the United Nations Charter, an effort defeated by British and Soviet opposition, though endorsed by the Chapultepec Conference in Mexico City in 1945. Guarantees of press freedom also became part of the peace treaties with Italy, Romania, Hungary, Finland, Germany, and Japan. Congressional advocates unsuccessfully proposed Free press riders to relief legislation for the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Agency, and were later to incorporate that theme as a quid pro quo of economic point for assistance to no free press, no relief. But the State Department objected that this would look like cultural imperialism, thereby anticipating its third world critics of the future. Anti-communism and witch hunts. The commercial advantage masqueraded as an ethical imperative in UNESCO's communication sector helped turn it into a hotbed for politics in the upcoming struggle over the empire of ideas. As William Benton put it, anti-communists were also preparing to politicize the neutrality and integrity of that nascent organization. In the 1938 congressional elections, a domestic conservative reaction had stimulated the House Un-American Activities Committee under Representative Martin Dees to narrow the acceptable range of political discourse by attacks on New Deal liberals and other left-wing dupes. The Foreign Agents Registration Act of that year and the Smith Act of 1940 tightened up the surveillance and possible punishment of subversives with foreign or un-American ties. A renewed Red Scare temporarily went into limbo when the wartime alliance with the Soviet Union surfaced, but dangerous ideologic styles of guilt by association and even inference remained in place. At the war's end, they would reemerge and search for new targets of opportunity and not exclude the UN and UNESCO. It seems to be an American habit, after all, to combine internationalism with fits of nativist hysteria, the latter as anti-subversive antidote to the very notion of global involvement. Attorney General Palmer's Red Raid provided the backdrop for the League of Nations debate. Joe McCarthy helped introduce the United Nations to the American people, yet others had already anticipated McCarthyism and set the stage for it in 1945 as UNESCO itself saw the light of day, years that came to be called prelude to repression. At the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover was interviewing Whittaker Chambers and Elizabeth Bentley and warning President Truman that the State Department should dismiss Alger Hiss, organizer of the Dumbarton Oaks Conference on the UN and the San Francisco UN Conference that followed. International organizations might be found suspect by association with State Department Reds if Congress accepted the stories of communist infiltration therein. And some congressmen did, while others kept an abiding suspicion of multilateral agencies and political orientation. However, within the State Department that soon to be target of the congressional witch hunt, an anti-communist security system was already in place, checking the minds of men for signs of subversion. Ruth Shipley, in charge of the passport office, had already complained that overseas agencies during the war, when members of the OSS, OWL, OIAA, and OSS, now closing down, find themselves assigned to the state, they also discovered themselves subject to a rigid screening of their political beliefs. As William Benton described it, many undesirables, that is, communists or communist sympathizers, had served in the wartime information branches since a large reduction in force was necessary. In any case, Benton worked out a secret deal in the fall of 1945 with Senator Pat McCarran to amend the department's Appropriation Act in order to facilitate dismissals of suspected security risks. The legislation allowed the Secretary of State to bypass civil service procedures and to terminate an employee for the good of the service without branding anyone as a risk. Benton claimed all known or suspected risks had been discharged, although he admitted it was not perfectly done. While attacking subversives on the home front, Benton also worried about communist influence abroad that might endanger UNESCO. Since the organization seemed destined to be located in Paris, and since the Americans were worried lest France go communist, Benton negotiated with the French to limit the headquarters' commitment to 5 years and won French agreement to hold the general conferences
elsewhere and not insist on French Director General. These ominous intrusions of anti-communism in 1945 forecast an intense political battle for UNESCO's soul from the very start of its career. The politics of technology. Just as the press and personnel concerns seem somewhat distant from intellectual cooperation among educational, scientific, and cultural elites, intimidating that form of government would not cede its political interest to independent professionals. Some of the same foreign policy considerations also rose in apparently technical arenas. Illiteracy and poverty were not in the U.S. national interest either, as Walter Lades succinctly summed it up. UNESCO had a major role to play in creating an educational citizenry because the level of education is directly related to the level of international trade, and education can be a very influential factor in economic progress. Since 1/2 to 2/3 of the world still remained less developed, the United States had to help them achieve Western-oriented progress. We need markets overseas and opportunities for investment, Levy's argued, and UNESCO could help fulfill those expectations. Culture might be a similar tool of economic influence, for trade was to believe, to follow, and prosper from cultural contacts. It was crucial to U.S. foreign commerce, Averell Harriman said, to have that world understand America, its life, the quality of its workmanship, and the quality of its product. And if UNESCO's science might make possible a dialogue with the Soviet Union, it might also support corporate multinationalism and help replace German scientific and technological preeminence with Anglo-American supremacy. The quality of U.S. participation in UNESCO would also depend on its own definition and management of cultural relations, since those were supposed to complement and support similar activities in the international level, a kinship of interest expected of all member states. However, at war's end, the prospect was still somewhat uncertain. Foreign Service career officers had not yet had the time to internalize this new level of diplomatic contact, nor were they convinced it would lead to opportunities to advance. They regarded the newcomers from the wartime propaganda and information eras as dubious and unassimilable group, and nurtured deep-seated suspicions about their usefulness to traditional diplomacy, according to Benton. Certain old-line State Department regulars even spread unfriendly rumors about Benton to sabotage the man and his program. In addition, the State Department did not clearly distinguish between the roles both information and cultural relations play and what results were to be expected from each, and the tendency was already developing to regard both as political instruments, tools of foreign policy priorities of the moment, and projecting American influence outward upon the world in a unilateral one-way movement. In spite of the strong currents of national interest lurking below the smooth surface of benevolence, the United States maintained a deep-seated conviction of UNESCO that would avoid politics. Having successfully masked its own ideologic agenda from itself and mastered the art of cognitive dissonance, the U.S. expected to join an organization, an organization committed to its own liberal definition of the post-war world. It would serve U.S. ends, both strictly technical international means, devoid of partisan advantage, through strictly technical international means devoid of partisan advantage. Meanwhile, what of the UNESCO idea itself, apart from the U.S. conception of it? The international tabula rasa of hope needed interpretation to give abstract nature, form, and personality. If one assumed there were at least three worlds, the rich and industrial West, the socialist East, and the impoverished, undeveloped South, might all perceive different futures for UNESCO, even within these blocks. Varieties of national traditions might spawn an equal number of possible directions for UNESCO to take. Nor would these separate fiefdoms of specialized professionalism, as James Sewell has described them, necessarily agree on similar programs of action to carry out the idealistic intentions of UNESCO's constitution. From its origins, UNESCO represented pluralism rampant, and its purpose and nature have been the subject of intense controversy ever since. This was not only because of the ambiguity and breadth of its goals, but also because it had to serve the common welfare of mankind by good works and redeem man's mind by ideologic indoctrination in the cause of peace. Could any organization devoted to saving the flesh and the spirit of humanity avoid doctrinal dispute, the outbreak of heresy, or finally the call for reformation? Certainly not if this true church of secular salvation became a consort of any national interest, no matter how righteous it might claim to be. The West and the start of UNESCO. Drawing immediate inspiration from the Atlantic Charter and its social obligations, spelled out in the Four Freedoms and from the revulsion against Axis propaganda, the Council of Allied Ministers of Education united in 1942 to win the struggle for men's minds and decontaminate the residue of hate the Nazis had instilled. Initially aimed at educational and cultural relief and rehabilitation, came develop longer-range plans for a permanent presence on the international scene. The Americans joined the movement in 1944, that when the UNRA and Allied denazification programs in the enemy territories preempted the political duties of the occupation phase of recovery. CAME proposed what was to become UNESCO to carry on the work and make it universal. Since the Soviet Union did not join UNESCO until 1954, preferring its bilateral route in cultural relations, the planning and formulation of the new organization remained a Western project, but not a totally harmonious one, as frontline victims of warmongering and subversive propaganda and its proponents during the interwar years of international conventions restraining its dissemination, the Europeans did not express the same enthusiasm for unfettered mass communications. And they suspected the U.S. drive for international press freedom might be aimed at their own entrenched wire servicing prerogatives. The London flow doctrine, the London-based economists, for example, in December 1944 recognized that the free flow doctrine would give U.S. resources a dominance to make the world safe for the Associated Press as well as for democracy. The British, in fact, saw the U.S. mania for eliminating all barriers to the free flow of information as similar to a large naval power proclaiming freedom of the seas, and they enlisted Latin Americans and others in opposition under the banner of cultural self-determination, another premonition of third world anguish in the 1970s. For their part, the French focused on the intellectual elite cooperation as the basis of peace in keeping with their long-standing leadership in that field, and combined it with the advancing the status of NGO participation. Membership representation and the choice of Director General also occasioned differences among the Allied founders. The United States draft, interestingly, gave its current denunciation of the concept and proposed a more status scheme of organization with persons elected to the executive board as representatives of state and not selected as individuals of rank in their professional community as finally determined. The U.S. also favored a strong Director General, as Roger Coate argues, to build the democratic order. Believing he could swing the election to an American, Benton thought Francis Biddle would become a walk of the candidate, but perhaps Biddle could not be persuaded when Julian Huxley of England won nomination. His left-wing atheistic philosophy distressed the U.S., but they limited Huxley's term to 2 years and took the deputy director generalship position with its important oversight of administration and budget. Benton acknowledged the reality of politics in the fight to control UNESCO, since that involved power over the ideas UNESCO would circulate and promote. However grand the design and the sense of limitless potential, and however intense the political maneuvering over the agenda of action, neither seemed capable of generating the funds commensurate with the dreams or demands for help. Is there some law of funding? The budgets must be in inverse proportion to the size of the plans they are intended to support. Given the expectations of the urgent needs, the budget was minuscule, about one-half that of the University of Chicago. Huxley's proposed $10 million budget itself did not come close to executing a decent program, and the United States held it to $6 million. 40 years later, the budget was still an issue, but some of the illusions of accomplishment had adjusted to the penurious realities. One wonders whether nations could tolerate a UNESCO with the funds actually needed to build the defenses of peace. Getting started. By the fall of 1946, UNESCO had received the requisite ratifications to set up shop and begin business in its temporary headquarters in Paris. The new Director General and his secretariat staff might well have wondered what kind of hot potato they had been handed and have walked away from the job right then. Only the frenzied enthusiasm of the founders and the passionate hopes of their human constituency must have attracted them to the awesome task that was about to commence. The road they would travel was heavily booby-trapped, and it was not at all clear that there were any cure for the hatred and mistrust it was now their duty to alleviate. Any assessment of UNESCO must, therefore, start with the realization that it had been created to accomplish not the difficult, but the impossible. No wonder Priestley and Benton used the word underrated. The UN's collective security peacekeeping mandate was easy by comparison. The miracle that UNESCO was instructed to perform involved reshaping the collective attitudes and values of the world's population, still living within the as yet undiminished boundaries of national sovereignty and cultural diverse traditions. The massive psychological and therapeutic challenge was to be undertaken both on the couch of intellectual collaboration across a spectrum of disciplines and along the daily social engineering by mass communications. The habit of international cooperation and the mutual regard for each other's dignity and freedom would develop in the planning and execution of innumerable works of global improvement and projects of transcultural understanding. Both the elite and popular-minded would supposedly respond favorably to the double dose of technical progress, relieving physical distress of all kinds and of emotional catharsis existing in mental anxieties that sabotage human solidarity. UNESCO itself would have to be a jack of all trades, initiating, servicing, operating, collecting, preserving, publishing, storing, and analyzing. It would have to be a world educator, librarian, scientist, historian, arts council, archaeologist, social scientist, communicator, diplomat, negotiator, and talent scout. Though its duties and responsibilities seem improbably broad, their discharge might be limited by inherent contradictions in its authority to act. UNESCO was a creature of national governments, yet in some ways independent of and greater than them. How much independence and autonomy would it attain, especially as it reached out to influence minds across and within the territorial limits of the member states? As the intervention of the West imbued with Western values, would its purpose be to universalize those standards or provide a forum for their re-examination and amendment by those with different norms? How would it find agreement on aims or methods when its own pluralism enhanced national, regional, cultural, or disciplinary diversity? And what would happen if UNESCO's influence, if the world again polarized into hostile camps battling each other for access to the very minds UNESCO was trying to alter? In the genesis of UNESCO, the founders assumed they were creating an organization that would transform the future. That is, of course, a conceit of all inventors, especially of the utopian variety. No one contemplates how the future will transform the organization. No utopian is that far-sighted. However, before UNESCO could grapple to the world and change, the world changed. The world changed, and one might say, took UNESCO by the throat. What had the founders not foreseen? They did not recognize the disruptive force of their own technology on the cultures and minds of people that were the supposed beneficiaries of it. UNESCO would not, therefore, have an opportunity to apply its healing solutions in a stable world economy. Rather, it would have to operate in the global equivalent of a massive urban renewal project, where it would attempt to get the developers to listen to the human and cultural impact statements of its many clients. This technological revolution and the pace of change would have formed the culture shock that changed men's minds faster than UNESCO could restore them. This was unexpected, and UNESCO became an arena for the hue and cry that followed, a place where the weak could lodge their grievances against the strong. And the more involved UNESCO itself might become in technical assistance, the more time it would have to spend adjusting the local attitudes and values to the subsequent cataclysm of change, trying to restore enough balance to build the defenses of peace. Nor did the founders, in their victorious ethnocentrism, envision the rapid decolonization of the world in the immediate post war years. UNESCO had been established as a kind of club of the rich and powerful West, intent on institutionalizing the traditions and practices that had been part of their own modernization. Unlike the Wilsonian concept of the League of Nations, the UN system had been conceded the right to universality of membership. The explosion of national liberation would become a culture shock for the West, a forced and sudden affirmative action program that would challenge Western ascendancy in that once exclusive fellowship of the elite. And UNESCO once again would have to pursue its own agenda of work while containing and moderating the ideologic aftershocks of the earthquake of independence. In addition, the organization would have to adjust rapidly to the influx of new members with their many importunate demands for assistance and equality of treatment, straining UNESCO's resources and management skills. One is reminded of the continental expansion of the United States with the strains and divisions of the territory's admission of the equal membership it occasioned. If Lincoln could argue that the Union could not exist half slave and half free, then UNESCO might plead with equal urgency that the world would no longer survive one-third rich and two-thirds poor. The inequality in resources had not, in fact, been given its due as a potential virus of discord for UNESCO's future health. The imbalance would have an impact in several ways. In the arena of mass communications and free flow, the sudden release of superior information power on the world would increase rather than diminish the tensions and misunderstandings. UNESCO had been called upon to relieve intense intrusions of message, like the technology itself, would challenge the indigenous cultures on the receiving end, tending to cast them as dependents in a process of cultural recolonization. As TV Satyamurthy has noted, it is impossible to sustain a healthy international community by means of a one-way transfusion of skills of a moral and political character from one culture to another. UNESCO's voice for a dynamic and reciprocal interchange with a mutual assimilation would have to struggle against the unexpected magnitude of alien voices imposing by propaganda the value of their own culture on others. And much of that one-way intervention of norms would be conducted by covert and deceptive forms of disinformation. Financial power would also express its authority in UNESCO's own internal governments, since the assessment of member states represented the overall economic status. While originally viewed as the moral equivalent of a progressive income tax, the scaling of dues without any right to enforce their collection left those by making significant contributions with the prerogative of a veto should UNESCO somehow offend their national interest. It was the self-same privilege of financial extortion among the newly independent states that crippled their own union for the decades under the Article of Confederation. UNESCO could not have known how its autonomy would be assailed by similar sanctions or the threat of them during future controversies over sensitive political issues. Although the disparity of wealth was to play its role in complicating UNESCO's work, none of the actors of the London Founding Conference could have imagined how quickly and completely the organization's environment would be contaminated by Cold War rivalries. Once the Allied unity had dissipated, UNESCO would find itself one of the endangered international species, likely to have its neutrality and program objectives exposed by the devastating emanations of ideology from one of the other center of imperial power. From the one or the other center of imperial power, even at the regional level, continuing episodes of international violence would overwhelm UNESCO's search for mutual understanding. These unresolved instances of internecine struggle were destined to explode like delayed action bombs in UNESCO's midst, as the Palestinian problem and the Namibia issue would do many Cold Wars of mutual animosity as heated as the larger division between East and West. As the high tide of Allied enthusiasm receded in the late 1940s, UNESCO might have wondered whether it would be left like some beached whale on the shores of forgotten hope. Yet it was to demonstrate a remarkable ability to survive, tenacious in its will to contribute, and luckily unaware of the future's own malicious schemes for its undoing. When Richard Hoggart spent time in Paris as an assistant director general in the 1970s, he remembered the words of the delegate from Mali about the organization's important oral history program. When an old man dies in one of 4 villages, the delegate said, a whole library disappears. Hogarth kept his own zeal and sanity intact by staying in touch with the extraordinary grassroots activity. UNESCO carried on and never forgot the global misery, endurance, and courage of the humanity it served. Awed by the many different strengths and resilience people can show, Hogarth recognized how UNESCO still maintained that sense of worldwide involvement and common brotherhood that had been its original mission. Excuse me. In viewing the history of UNESCO's relationship with the United States and exploring the public and official interactions, that deeper historic presence should not be forgotten and be developed by big power politics, derided as a do-gooding dilettante and often treated by the West with amused scorn. If noticed at all, UNESCO or the UNESCO question will not go away. It has survived the impossible dream of its founders and the betrayal of their support. It has survived the 40 years of wandering in the desert's nationalism disdain. Rooted in the endurance, courage, strength, and resilience of those welfare it represents, UNESCO will be out there building the defenses of peace, whether or not the United States stand by its side. Because the wild, foolish expectations of the founders were the right ones. That the United States gave up on them, UNESCO did, is the history that must now unfold. So that's the chapter. That's that chapter. UNESCO's origins, liberal hopes, and liberal assumptions. Just give me 1 minute. I'll be right back. I'm just going to take a 1 minute break. Okay, we're going to do our post-reading analysis. So this is the fun part. This is the fun part, and this is the part where, I get to giggle a little bit. So, bear with me. It's, enjoyable part. I get to giggle at the expense of the Yankee conartists, liar, frauds. So let's, go through it. So we're doing UNESCO's origins, liberal hopes, and liberal assumptions. So we started with, the new multilateralism was the first discussion we had. We talked about the State Departments and the Yankees' inertia. That's the standard thing. The Yankees had a huge inertia for which they were, basically unable to do anything. They were, basically just propagandists. They were fraud, liar, con artists. Yankees, and they did really nothing other than just, do nothing, basically. They did nothing. So we continued on. We talked about some of the things about UNESCO. Some of the things about UNESCO were, pretty straightforward. We discussed the free press and the UNESCO Constitution. So basically, realizing that culture could now could wield irresistible political influence, a fact underscored by pre-war and wartime propaganda successes. The U.S. delegation to UNESCO insisted that communication receive an equal emphasis with education, science, and culture as one of UNESCO's main priorities. And the U.S. meant, of course, mass communications, for those were the fast track of immediate impacts on minds as opposed to traditional instruments of the slow print media. And the other three arenas. Ideas, Benton insisted, are weapons. And the mass media, obviously, were the informational equivalent of missile delivery systems. Unleashing the U.S. media by guaranteeing the international freedom of the press, breaking the foreign wire services cartel, monopoly of world news, and promoting the, quote, free enterprise model of the news dissemination would thus tie the self-interest of U.S. publishers, broadcast, and wire service owners to UNESCO's search for the architect of peace. So you can see the slow print media is the media the U.S. didn't like, right? The slow print media has more of an impact on the mind But if you can, make lie missiles, like missiles of lies, just launch lie missile number 1, lie missile, fraud missile, con artist missile 3, like fraud missile 4, quack missile 6, charlatan missile 7, con artist missile 8. Then that's the U.S. Press. That's the U.S. press. That's basically what the U.S. press is. It's launching missiles of fraud, like fraud missile 1, con artist missile 2, lie missile 3, fabrication 4, omission and selective reporting 5. Then quack missile 6, charlatan missile 7, and the list goes on. So that's the idea of the press for the United States. It's a racist group of Yankee butcher rapists, and that's how they use their press. So we talked also about journalistic entrepreneurs purported to be convinced that a U.S. free press and free exchange of news could end international misunderstandings and prevent war, dismissing their commercial ambitions and profitable investments as irrelevant. The media leaders define their products as unbiased, partial, and unreliable. In fact, the basis of peace, since their news would not be tainted or falsified by government censorship of control. So intense was this commitment to the free market ideology that they strenuously opposed at first any United States government information activity at all in the post-war international sphere. William Benton and his State Department allies had to fight hard to overcome this hostility, a sort of dress rehearsal for the controversy aroused by third world critics of free market information policies in succeeding decades. Even some of America's industry-owned practitioners considered the official media position a sanctimonious, smug attitude and wondered, did God anoint them? So basically, that basically says that, the press, the press is basically, it's the media leaders. The media leaders decide what we hear. So, let's just take an example. The racist butchers, do their murderous butchery, and for instance, Yankee, the Yankee, slaughter of Hispanics, right? Where these slaughter 50, 60 Hispanics, and then the media say, oh yeah, it'll work out, it'll all be fine, everything will be fine, they're dead now anyway, it doesn't matter. That's the media's interpretation of this, mass murder, right? I mean, you got to understand that these are different people, these are third world people, and their disappearance is not, tabulated by the racist, fraud con artists of Washington. It's not tabulated by the racist, fraud, con artist, liar, deliberate liar press. It's not tabulated by the quacks of American media. It's not tabulated at all. So the dead Hispanics are, just lost in the dust, right? I mean, that's the government's way. That's the Yankees, approach to free press. Free information flow is, dead Hispanics means, it'll all work out or it'll all be fine in the end. That's just the way it is. We just don't know. We don't know, and it'll all be fine. They're dead anyway, right? I mean, your government did it, and, you're racist, Yankee butcher rapist, but, that's besides the point, right? So anti-communism witch hunts, we got there. We talked about the ethical imperative of UNESCO's communication sector, hotbed for politics, struggle for the empire ideas, the Red Scare, right? Basically, it seems to be an American habit, after all, to combine internationalism with fits of nativist hysteria, the latter as an anti-subversive antidote to the very notion of global involvement. Attorney General Palmer's Red Raids provided the backdrop for the League of Nations debate. Joe McCarthy helped introduce the United Nations to the American people, yet others had already anticipated McCarthyism and set the stage for it in 1945 as UNESCO itself saw the light of day, years that came to be called prelude to repression. At the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover was interviewing Whittaker Chambers and Elizabeth Bentley and warning President Truman that the State Department should dismiss Alger Hiss, organizer of the Dumbarton Oak Conference on the UN and the San Francisco UN Conference that followed. International organizations might be found suspect of association with the State Department Reds if Congress accepted the stories of communist infiltration of them. And some congressmen did, while others kept an abiding suspicion of multilateral agencies' political orientation. So in summary, basically, that is, basically, nativist hysteria. So the fits of nativist hysteria, basically, McCarthyism, right? I mean, basically the Yankees, you just, kind of, Washington. What are you in UNESCO for, Washington? What is the Yankee in UNESCO for? I mean, if you have this attitude towards, people and, ideas, everyone's a subversive. Who doesn't have a nativist attitude? Who doesn't have a white nativist attitude? That means they're subversive. Then what are you doing in a third world organization? I won't see the understanding. Get out, Yankee. Get out of UNESCO. You don't belong there. If you have nativist attitudes, you have to purge this from your ideology before you join third world organizations. Your racist Yankee, rapist butchers, and fraud con artist liars need to change their ideology before they join third world organizations and you discuss things with others. You are racist Yankee, con artist, liar, fraud, Yankee, quacks. That's what it is. That's ultimately what it is. You have to understand the whole thing is that United States doesn't belong in UNESCO if they, accommodate nativist ideologies in their racist Yankee government. So until the Yankees purge this idea of nativism, my statement is get expelled from UNESCO or relieve yourself of being in UNESCO. You don't belong in a third world organization when you think of third world people as subversive because they want to nationalize their oil. They want to nationalize their national resources. They want to have sovereignty over their people and justice system, and they want to progress. If you want to be subversive, then get out of UNESCO and join your colonial racist clubs that can allow you to imperialize and slaughter, and then the world will hit you with, allegations against your prestige. Your prestige will drop miserably in the world, and you'll become, the Yankee mafia. Not the Yankee government, but the Yankee mafia is at it again. So that's where we have to go to. That's where we have to say. So, basically, the State Department that's soon to be targeted, the congressional witch hunt, and anti-communist security system was already in place, checking the minds of men for signs of subversion. Ruth Sipley, in charge of the passport office, had already complained that she had to issue travel documents to many communists and various overseas agencies in the war. Basically members of the OSS, OWI, OIA were now closing down, found themselves assigned to the state. They had discovered themselves subject to rigid screening of their political beliefs. And as William described it, many undesirables, communists or communist sympathizers, which we said are nationalists, had served in the wartime information branches. So that was that. And then we had just a couple more comments here. In spite of the strong currents of national interest lurking below the smooth surface of benevolence, the United States maintained a deep-seated conviction that UNESCO would itself avoid politics, having successfully mastered its own ideologic agenda from itself and mastered the art of cognitive dissonance. The U.S. expected to join an organization committed to its own liberal definition of the post-war world. It would serve U.S. ends through strictly technical international means, devoid of partisan advantage. So basically, the U.S. just uses UNESCO as a tool for its own geopolitical strategy. Like I said, get out of UNESCO, Yankee. Your motives are suspect in every way in your, joining this organization. And then we're going to finish, we basically finished with, there was, basically that was the thing, basically, all right, so we went, nor do the founders in their victimist ethnocentrism envision the rapid decolonization of the world to the immediate post-war years. UNESCO had been established as a kind of club of the rich and powerful West, intent on institutionalizing the tradition and practices that had been part of their own modernization. Unlike the Wilsonian concept of the League of Nations, the UN system had been conceded the right to universality of membership. The explosion of national liberation would become a culture shock for the West, a fourth and sudden affirmative action program that would challenge Western ascendancy in that once exclusive fellowship of the lead. And UNESCO once again would have to pursue its own agenda to work while containing moderating the ideologic aftershocks of the earthquake of independence. So again, the Yankees in the West were against,
the third world, decolonization, the third world independence and sovereignty. And so basically that's what the Yankees are about. Keeping the third world in oppression, keeping the third world in subjugation and colonial imperialism, and then waging war on the third world. And then, pretending to be friends by being a member of UNESCO. Yankee get out is our statement. Or please expel the Yankees from UNESCO is, our statement. Please expel the Yankees from UNESCO. They don't belong in UNESCO. Again, Hope and Folly, the United States and UNESCO, 1945 to 1985. We're going to finish with just a few jokes at the end. We talked again today about Trump ICJ. Please, refer to the video. We talked about the cultural imperialism joke. I thought it was very funny. The racist liar press, con artists, lies, fabrications, and distortions. We said the Yankee government needs to be expelled from UNESCO for secretive anti-third world colonial wars after becoming a member of the organization, after having committed libel and hate speech against the organization by the U.S. mass media and academia and government in 1984, and then no funding the organization during their last years of membership. They were endowed of United Nations Education, Scientific, and Cultural Organization for 37 years and did not pay a dime of dues to the world progressive literacy, food equality, medical infrastructure, improved scientific research, education for the third world and public, and promoting the third world's cultural autonomy and sovereignty. So please, expel the United States from UNESCO. They did, wars against Venezuela, Iran, and Cuba. Please be aware of that. True false ethics quiz. We're going to just crack some jokes here to finish up. Basically the racist Yankee government should be expelled from UNESCO for improper conduct of the fraud Yankee liars and excused absence in the third world education by the con artist Yankees. That's true again. Basically the fraud racist Yankees relationship with UNESCO is that of a student Yankee with UNESCO teacher, in which the student fraud con artist Yankee says the teacher is stupid and that they want to drop out of the course. That's also true. That's correct. Basically the Monroe doctrine, we talked about that. The racist Yankee con artist liars attacked UNESCO because they wanted to lie and commit con artist fraud, so they wouldn't allow licensing of journalists. That's also true. That we talked about the Yankee con artist racist media specializes in lies, fabrications, distortions, omissions, and selective reporting. Basically that's, that. The racist Yankee fraud, con artist liars like to pretend they were paying huge amounts of money to UNESCO when they were stealing from the organization and not paying their dues. That's false. So again, Krishna Iyer with the Iyer Think Tank in Delray Beach. Have a great day. See you tomorrow.